Virtual namaskar to everyone in a virtual law school, hopefully with real listeners. Everything else is virtual. And I'm very happy to be here again with Professor Pokhriyal, with the entire community of academics, with students, researchers, and more importantly, with an excellent ambience, which I felt and experienced, and which I told your Dean last time when I had the privilege to address you, of a great institution functioning in splendor, in quietness, and doing its own work. And those were, of course, happier times when I visited you. But even now, I think the show must go on and education cannot stop. Well, friends, we have an interesting topic today. And it could really cover three aspects. The first is the origin of this concept of federalism. And the origin is not merely amidst our founding fathers in the Constituent Assembly, but in the thinking process of those who created this great country, and even, I would say, did the remarkable feat of creating a constitution amidst troubled times. So this is the conception. The second is, the operational reality. Conceptions and their evolution frequently vary. And the very interesting part, the second part of my address, will be this huge hiatus between the conception of federalism in our system and its operational reality over our 75 odd years of our republic. And the third is, just at the 74th, 75th year, some more particularized aspect of federalism in COVID times, which might be surprising, which might surprise you, but it has interesting legal facets because COVID has made us unlearn and also learn new things in everything, including law. Well, friends, the interesting part, the fascinating part about federalism when I thought about it, and this was some time ago when I delivered the first lecture on it, I was struck by the fact that the pillars of Indian constitution, and you know the pillars, you know secularism, you know maybe socialism, you know fraternity, so many words. And you know that the Indian polity stands on institutional pillars and non-institutional pillars. And we are the world's oldest, we are the world's largest, most vibrant democracy because those institutional and non-institutional pillars have stood us in good stead. Amidst the non-institutional pillars are, of course, secularism, socialism, fraternity, the concept of dignity of the individual, all the great words of the preamble of the Indian Constitution. Amongst the institutional pillars is Parliament, the Election Commission, the CAG. For that matter, institutions like the army, the nameless, faceless, anonymous institution, which protects us. Now, in all these institutional and non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy, it is fascinating to note that federalism is nowhere mentioned. I was struck by the fact that federalism doesn't find a mention in the preamble. I was struck by the fact that federalism does not find, and this is perhaps even not known to students who may have done a class on this subject, is not mentioned as a single word in the world's, one of the world's longest constitutions. As you know, the Indian constitution, I would not say is the longest. I mean, there must be a few tin pot dictatorships which will have longer constitutions, because the trick is that the longer the constitution, the greater the tin pot dictatorship. But India is a shining exception. But we have one of the longest constitutions in the world. And it is fascinating to note that the word federal or federalism doesn't find mention anywhere in the Constitution. Now, a small little caveat here, for those of you who are very clever and intelligent and are rushing to your small pocket books of Constitution, you will find the word federal in many articles. And you will be mistaken or you will triumphantly put up your hand and say, look, I proved you wrong. It is not so. There is the word. And you will find the word in 112 article, in 128, in 135, in 366, in 374, etc., etc. But that does not belie or refute what I am saying. Those are all references to the federal court. Each one of them. Federal court, as you know, was the immediate precursor to our Indian Supreme Court. And therefore, these articles are dealing with a number of judges in the Supreme Court will be as in the federal court. Terms and conditions in the Supreme Court will be as in the federal court, etc., etc. This federal or this federalism has nothing to do with the federalism we are talking about. Nothing whatsoever. And therefore, this fascinating point as we start is that this word, this concept, this idea, this reference does not exist in the world's, one of the world's longest constitutions, but certainly the constitution governing the world's largest democracy and one of the most vibrant democracies. And then the killer point, something not mentioned, something not adverted to, is part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. Federalism, as you know, from way back in Bombay, and Bombay was in the 90s, mid-90s and first part of the 90s. That's almost 25 years ago. In para 96, for those students who are interested, categorically holds federalism to be part of the Indian basic structure. After that, there are many judgments, Kuldeep Nayar's, etc., all of which hold it to be part of the Indian basic structure. And you know what a basic structure is. A basic structure is something, and we are the proud inventors. Our system, I always call the most remarkable avant-garde legal system. Apart from PIL, apart from so many things, we have invented basic structure, which means that a constitutional amendment can be unconstitutional. Fascinating concept which countries have now copied or adopted. But in effect, it means that something which is a basic structure shall be unamendable, shall be undetractable, shall be non-derogable, cannot be diluted. And Bombay onwards, federalism, something not in our preamble, not anywhere in the Constitution, is nevertheless a part of India's basic structure, which means it cannot be taken away from us even by a constitutional amendment. Well, having thus put the setting of federalism, let us also start with a more general question that when you look at federalism, you cannot look at it diversed from the context. It is not the text, but much more so the context of federalism, which is vital to appreciate before we jump into the heart of the topic. Federalism is one of the most important non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy because it is in the setting of the world's, of planet Earth's most diverse spot. There is no more diverse spot on planet Earth than India, is my view. It doesn't matter whether you call it salad bowl, whether you call it melting pot, but that India is the world's most diverse spot. The world's second most populous spot. The seventh largest in area. For years, the third largest the third strongest or largest in terms of purchasing power parity. The sixth largest by way of GDP. And what amazing, unbelievable diversity. 22 scheduled languages, 700 mother tongues, 2,000 dialects, 4 religions, birthplace is India. Other religions not born here, but we are the second or third largest populous country of those religions or religious adherents. Sounds, smells, rituals, dresses, tyohars, festivals, habits. This humongous diversity is vital for federalism. And that is why you might think I'm talking of the subject, but it is very important to put federalism in this setting. And in this setting, why is federalism relevant and why is the setting relevant? Because federalism, friends, is nothing but another name for managing diversities. Federalism is nothing but a legal technique, a constitutional mechanism to manage diversities. It is an inalienable concept and component of shared and participatory democracy. It is something which gives us a shared identity. And the concept of federalism warns you and prevents, to the extent a concept can, against monopolistic and unilateral governance. In fact, in an essay I wrote for the Indian Institute of Public Administration over 10 years ago, which won me the best essay prize for that year on federalism, I said it is the best safety valve for the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds being dissent, discomfort, and dissatisfaction. Because when you have this in a democracy as vibrant as India, with so much diversity, dissent, dissatisfaction, and discomfort is a vital part of it. Then the concept of federalism acts like a pressure cooker, like a safety valve of a pressure cooker. Otherwise, these will explode. And decentralization, which is another facet of federalism, helps you to contain and quarantine conflicts at the state level, at the decentralized level, at the tehsil level, at the district level, etc. It quarantines conflicts, first of all, away from the center at the state level. It equally quarantines conflicts from the state level at sub-state levels. And it is fascinating how our constituent forefathers, remember, and that's a totally different story, our constitutional manufacturers were the wisest people collectively you could think of. Why? Because they were going through the most troubled times from 1946 to 1949, when they sat for 3 years in the Constituent Assembly to draft this comprehensive document. The world's largest migration, millions of deaths, divisiveness, fissiparous tendencies, breakaway portions, rebellious states. In the midst of that, even the very idea of drafting such a liberal, such a amazing democratic document like our Constitution is something which is unparalleled. It's not happened anywhere else in the world. Now, when they were sitting for these 3 long years, obviously, they were not insulated from what is happening around them. So in the context of federalism, they were constantly talking of it, as the debates will show you, but also worrying about it. The biggest worry was that federalism, which in constitutional terms can also be looked at as decentralization, decentralized powers from the center to the states, states to the local units, may lead to breakaway tendencies, fissiparous tendencies. It may lead to breakaway states. The Indian Union may be threatened. And you read right through the Constituent Assembly debates this fear, this genuine apprehension. Which is why, in conception, they created largely a unitary state. In conception, in birth, in design, because of this fear. What is a unitary state? Obviously, our model became England. As you know, there are various models. The closest to an almost full unitary state is England. So we took several unitary features, but we wanted to have some federalism. So we gave federalism despite our fears. And yet the fears made us give decentralization and then create an exception which still kept power with the center. What is 356 otherwise? 356 is the power of the central government to take over a state government. That is the antithesis of federalism. What is 355 for that matter? The previous article which nobody notices and is hardly ever used. The power of the central government to send forces to maintain certain law and order situations in states. It is the antithesis of federalism. Why the maximum number of items are in list 1? List 1 is twice the size of list 2. Last article, if I remember, was 97. which means list one, as you know, is the exclusive central government competence. Not competence, exclusive, only central government. Fourthly, why the residual entry 97 in the main central list? Why not in other lists? Because the idea was to create a unitary constitution. And even in other clauses, special powers or exceptions or derogations were given in our constitution. In particular, in Articles 250, 249, 253, etc., etc. That in emergency, for example, the country can become a full unitary country. During an emergency declaration, there is no list 1, list 2, list 3. For special laws to implement international treaties, you don't need this division of lists. That is 253. And the most recent example is when an all India GST had to be made, then they had to utilize various provisions, including 246 capital A. Now, these are actually great derogations from federalism. So what do we have till now? We have the conception of our creators, the desire to do federalism, the fear which made them draw back, conceiving, producing, manufacturing, and creating and designing largely a unitary state. In stark and following the English model, which is the most unitary, with limited federal powers, and even when they give federal powers, to draw back and contain by exceptions, by derogations. Which is why an Australian jurist called Kenneth Weir coined a very interesting phrase for India. He said quasi-federal. Quasi-federal is largely unitary, but pretending with some features to be federal. So basically unitary with some diluting features. The second part, and remember also the distinction, there are some pure federal states. The closest is USA. They have what is known as bottom-up federalism. What is USA? USA, actually, many of the states you count as the 50 states on the American flag, those stars you have. Many of them were independent countries. Texas was a country. Louisiana was a French country. So many countries. Alaska belonged to Russia. Now, different states who were sovereign countries, California was a country, ceded power to come into a union. So they gave up power. Each country gave up power to become a country, a new country. So that is bottom-up federalism. That is, in fact, real, true federalism. India was top-down, not bottom-up. You had a country which gave some federal powers. You merged the princely states. You merged British India. You had to look after unity. Now, the second part of my story tells you, in this setting of largely a unitary creation, the fascinating story of how in operational reality, in 75 years, we have had what commentators, eminent ones, have called a fascinating story of accidental federalism, unintended federalism, inadvertent federalism. Namely, a story how over these 70 years, with the constitution being the same, our conception of our nirmatas being this, in operational reality, how we have become radically more federal than anybody imagined. So between what the parents conceived and what was born, and what evolved as a child through teenagership and now adulthood, is the fascinating difference in hiatus between federalism in conception and federalism in operational reality over 70 years. So having described to you the origin and the debates, which covers the first part, and I am not reading to the debate, but any of you interested, and if you read parts of the CAD, which should be mandatory reading for some time every day for people who are interested in constitutional law, this debate is reflected everywhere that we want federalism, but we can't give powers because states will break away. So this is the conflict paradox which they go through. I now come to the second part of this fascinating story. So we ended up in 1949, 26th November, which finally culminated and transformed into actual Republic Day on 26th January 1950, with a constitution which was in conception and design largely non-federal, or rather unitary with federal features, or rather, as Kenneth Weir said, quasi-federal. Now let us see the 6 fascinating tendencies which in 75 years has made it radically more federal. The first of these 6, linguistic federalism. Those of, I'm not that old, but certainly older than some of the audience. Those of us who were children or younger in the 50s and 60s, and certainly our parents, remember the acrimonious, tension-ridden language riots of the 60s. Most of us today do not, thankfully. Language was a very emotive issue. Whether each state should have 1 language, 2 languages, 3 languages, which should have primacy, these took away a large part of our exertions, but more than that, they created a lot of divisiveness in the nascent years of our republic, right till the end of the 50s, and indeed in the 60s as well. And you had what is known as language riots. Part of the problem was at least improved or partially solved by the creation of linguistic-based states. Most of the states which you have up to today included, of course, some of the more recent states are not always on linguistic lines, although Telangana is. But most of the states in the 56 reform, what is the states reorganization reform, were created on linguistic lines. So Gujarat carved out of Maharashtra on the basis of Gujarati-speaking people, and Rajasthan similarly on the basis of Rajasthani-speaking people, and so on and so forth. Of course, considerations need not be language, but that time language was the principal consideration. So that did quieten out temperatures. But the point I'm making on linguistic federalism, which is linguistic decentralization, linguistic discretion, was, I think, the very important step taken in the Nehruvian years of adopting the 3-language formula. 3-language formula, which meant English, which meant Hindi, and which meant the state language, has largely, till today, I say largely, there are exceptions, worked well. It has contained conflicts. It has served us for almost 60 years out of our 75 years of life. It has given recognition and removed or minimized fears about robbing or overwhelming the language of the state by superimposition. So you have a happy coexistence of 3. And let me tell you a practical point. We are now 75 years. Tell me, when has been the maximum growth of Hindi? The maximum growth of Hindi has been from 1990-92 onwards till today. It is the time when there have been coalition governments. It is the time when there have been mixed bags. It is the time, and the reason is that the moment you stop imposing Hindi, Hindi flourishes. The moment you start telling a state you shall have Hindi, Hindi suffers. We spent many years in the 60s and 70s trying to impose languages. You shall teach, you shall not teach. Didn't work. One of the biggest reasons for Hindi working today in linguistic federalism and decentralization is not all the crores we spent. As an MP, I get huge amounts of material, and I'm a member sometimes or get material from Hindi Salakar Samiti. Everything is translated. But that doesn't promote Hindi. What promotes Hindi much more, friends, is the fact that you have had an explosion of media, the visual channels. The visual channels, remember, the largest number of them are Hindi. The largest viewership is Hindi. And there you will find our southern friends. If you are not forcing them, if you are not making them conscious, self-conscious, they will sit easily on a OB van and speak in whatever form they can. When you make them conscious, when you threaten them, when you force them, when you underline it, then it's a bad thing. So this is linguistic federalism. We have become, from our 1950s days, a much more linguistically federal country. Our languages have been given much more recognition and primacy. I don't know what the new NEP will do. That's a different subject by itself. But as of today, largely it has worked well. Second, the impact of the judiciary on federalism, what you might call judicial federalism. Out of my six, this is the second. What is the meaning of judicial federalism? Doesn't mean that the judiciary has become decentralized. Judicial federalism, I mean this, that if you look carefully, see, I told you 356 is the antithesis of federalism. So because 356 allows me to take away a democratically elected state government and make it central rule, or in Jammu and Kashmir, governor's rule. It is in that sense anti-federal. Now, 356 was used roughly 99 times till 2000. Till the year 2000, in 50 years of our republic, it was used more than 99 times or 99 times, 100 times. Since then, it has been used hardly in a major way. I mean, totally would be 15, 20 times, but in a major way, not even 10 times. Now, the reason is not good political sense. The reason is not political color of governments. Every government wants to use it or misuse it, as the case may be. The reason is that we have had a series of judgments which have disciplined the parameters of 356. So you have controlled a creature which sometimes became a wild beast, 356. You have controlled it by judicial diktat, by dexterous riding by the Supreme Court. It has become a tamed beast, and therefore it is used very sparingly. What is that story? That story is simple. And I am privileged in having been part of almost the entire line of judgments from 2000 till now. The judgments known as Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, Arunachal Pradesh, Karnataka twice, including the midnight hearing, Maharashtra twice. These are what judgments? I'm not going to be Goa. So many states. These are those 10, 12 cases, and started with Bihar in the Rameshwar case in 2004, 2005. These are those cases. Of course, the most important is Bommai, which came in 1993, 94. You have to understand as lawyers that earlier till 2000, including Bommai, a 356 would be imposed on a state. Suppose the chief minister of the state is Purvi Pokhriyal. Now she would be removed, central government would take over. She would start screaming, shouting, and file a petition. That petition will be decided after 4 years or 5 years, during which time Purvi Pokhriyal's government would have gone, a new government would be elected, the new government would also complete its term or fall down, and a third government would be running. So all the earlier judgments would give declaratory judgments which had no real impact. It did not pinch anybody's shoe. And Purvi Pokhriyal's only satisfaction was that she established the law, but got nothing on the ground. Now, what happened after Bommai was, and Bommai was also that, if you remember, Hegde was removed in Bangalore, and he filed his petition. By the time it was decided, 2 governments had come after Hegde, but it laid down the law. But the change in the cases which I have been privileged to be part of, Uttarakhand, Arunachal, Jharkhand, Bihar, recently Maharashtra, 3 times Karnataka, Goa. The changes are A, the courts realize that we have to act swiftly. 2, the courts realized that sermons or lectures or declaration of law, as in the Purvi example I gave after 4 years, 5 years, will not correct this malaise because I'm actually quashing it after 4 years. But the person has had advantage of his own wrong. So the second principle was don't allow people to take advantage of their own wrong. Third, that act in a manner that you have a fair decision very, very quickly, or in terms of floor test and change of government by floor tests, give the minimal time to prevent artificial majorities and minorities being created. Now, this has happened in all these 8 major cases where I've been privileged to lead the arguments, whether on the losing side or the winning side. But I've been part of all these 8, 9 cases. You'll be surprised many of these had what? These had 48 hours. 24 hours was tried, never was given, but 48 hours, sometimes 72 hours. Take, for example, the midnight case of Karnataka. Of course, this is not president's rule. Uttarakhand was president's rule, but they all involve majority formation. So 356 can't be used so easily when the court is moving so fast. I was in Chandigarh and we took a flight, and I asked them to, I landed on Thursday itself, and I asked them to move, on the Wednesday evening, and try if they can move. Wednesday evening, they moved. Wednesday midnight, around 1 o'clock, the hearing started. Went on till 5 o'clock. And then they heard it again on Friday morning. And on Friday, they gave a direction for a floor test on Saturday. And the argument of the other side in that Karnataka case was, give us at least, they started with 1 month. In 1 month, your lordship. Then they said, okay, not agreeing, give us 3 weeks. Then they said 15 days. Then they said, give us at least 1 week. Court said no. We started this case on Wednesday. Today is Friday. We would have said that you have the floor test today in the evening. But because MLAs are spread all over, have the floor test starting 10 o'clock tomorrow, 11 o'clock. It takes 4-5 hours to swear in MLAs in a new assembly, and the actual floor test will take place at 4 o'clock. This is the nitty-gritty change in jurisprudence, which has led. Now, with this, the person who wants to be over-adventurous has no reason to be over, because there's no premium on over-adventurous acrobatics. In Uttarakhand, I successfully won in a 356 case. For 10 days we fought. I was for the sitting chief minister. When the central government of that time felt that it was unable to get the state majority, it imposed president's rule on a Saturday evening. The hearing started on a Monday or a Tuesday, and in about 3 weeks' time, the then Chief Justice of Uttarakhand, Justice Joseph, quashed it. So who gets the advantage? Nobody takes advantage of his own wrong. So the next second federating influence in 70 years, which has made our country much more federal, is this: the judicial attitude, the judicial judgments, the vigor, the speed, the momentum, the pace, the direction has all changed. And therefore, obviously, the anti-federal elements have become weakened or diluted. You cannot impose 356 so easily. You cannot make artificial majorities so easily. Of course, there are exceptions. Courts are sometimes, slow and not been able to manage it. But yes, by and large, the attitude has changed. So this is the second, independent courts or judicial federal. Third, I remember that I was standing next to my father, actually by chance, as a youngster, a relative youngster, in 1985, when a call came from then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. And he said, Dr. L.M. Singhvi, you've written so much about Panchayati Raj and spoken about it. But in actual fact, Panchayats and Panchayati systems are lying in wrecks and ruins across the country. So there's no point talking about it. I wanted to do something about it. And without your consent, I'm appointing you chairman of a high-powered committee to lay out a blueprint for revitalization of Panchayati Raj. So thus was born the Dr. L.M. Singhvi Panchayati Raj Revitalization Committee. It gave its report later in that decade, 87 or so. In 92, and there was politics in between, there was delay, but that report was enacted as the seminal 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments, in 91 actually, which occupy now 30 articles, if you know, part 9 and 9A of the Constitution, which create municipalities, panchayats, and all the decentralized. It has created a revolution which you have not noticed, because classrooms are different from reality of federalism. What is the revolution? If you see, there are 20 articles, those ZZ articles which you don't get taught all the time, and those are like 40, 30 articles in those 2 chapters. What is the revolution? The revolution is there are a large number of subjects on which, forget this panchayat, even the state was not allowed to take decision, which were decided for you by the central government, are now not decided even by the state. They are decided by the panchayat. As you know, there is a 3-tier So a certain set of subjects is decided by the lowest tier. A second set of subjects at the district level is decided by that tier. And the third is the apex panchayat. But the decision making in administrative terms, so whether this school or bridge is necessary, how much is necessary, how quickly is necessary. Of course, they have their limits. The lower chap cannot give a big one, but there are limits. But the decision making, the responsiveness to local needs, it's all become decentralized decision making. What is an alternative synonym for federalism? Decentralized decision making. Federalism is nothing but decentralized decision making. Decision making may be administrative, may be political. Panchayati Raj, through these constitutional amendment, has brought in, and just like you have the 7th schedule, people don't know this, which has 3 lists. For each state, you are supposed to have 2 lists. That within the state, these matters the state will decide, but these matters exclusively panchayats will decide. Of course, there is a weakness there, because just like the states are also hesitant to give too much subjects to decide to the panchayats. They like their powers. But the point here is that in theory, you created a structure, but theoretical structure is not enough. Story is that after you gave the enabling structure by this amendment of 1991, based on the L.M. Singhvi report, the so-called 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments, what happened on the ground was a further revolution. Roughly, you can count 25 years is all. As a member of parliament, and now I'm in my 3rd term, which means by the time I leave, I'll be 18 years in parliament. When I go earlier to my home state, Rajasthan, and now to West Bengal, across the table from me, if I go to a village to inaugurate a project, or if I go to inaugurate a school or a hospital or a medical facility, more often than not, sitting across the table will be a woman, because they have 50% reservation for women. 50% reservation. We can't do it in parliament, we can't do it elsewhere, but we've done it in panchayats. Where not 50-33 is anyway there. Of course, by rotation, etc. Last count, we had about 2 crore elected members of panchayats. 2 crore, which is more than the population of most European countries. And 50% plus are women. They decide. They decide what, how much you will spend, what you will spend for, what you will promote, etc., etc. And this gives decentralization and federalism a huge kick, which it never had. And this has increased from 95 till today. These numbers were not there. 2 crore elected officials taking decisions locally. So both administrative and legal decentralization, which is federalism by another name, happened. My 4th federating influence out of my 6 is economic liberalization. As you know, the watershed year is considered to be 1991. Some people may say partially 1985, but certainly 1991. What is the meaning of economic liberalization to federalism? Delicensing. Previously, all central government decisions, most were central government decisions. I always say that if you look today, a state chief minister is 4 times more powerful than a central cabinet minister, though both are equal in rank. So the rank of a chief minister of a state and a cabinet minister center is same, but the power wielded by a state chief minister 3 to 4 times more than the central minister. You ask your friends who are top industrialists, many of them can pass a lifetime without coming to Delhi for any permission anymore. Previously, you had to come every weekend to Delhi. Why? Because you've delicensed. Delicensing is you've given away the powers of central government in many areas. Yes, you've had federalism of a very useful kind, but you've not had enough federalism at the state level, further decentralization. They should be decentralizing to panchayats. There, the pace is much slower. The state chief minister is the Shah and the king, which the central cabinet minister used to be in the 90s. But there is a huge change. And for a lot of decisions, decentralization means, for example, if you go on a road show to raise monies for investment, a chief minister requires no permission. Chief minister of state X can straight away go to USA and raise monies. These are significant federating influences post 91. My fifth one is fiscal federalism. These are all interesting how the concept was this, but how the actual operation became so much more liberal in terms of pro-federating influences. Ultimately, as every housewife or every manager of money or banker knows, what matters is the cash in your hand. All the rest is sermon and lecture. Well, at the end of the day, in the 90s or earlier, what was the money the states were getting? Of all the revenues, they were getting less than 30% or 30%. Today, roughly from 31%, you are somewhere at 43 and close sometimes to 45% of all revenues. Namely, if the central government gets 100 rupees, 43 to 45 rupees is given back to the state, whether in the form of grants, cesses, reimbursements, refunds, etc., whatever name you call it. The totality is, now that is a big boost to decentralization and federalism. This is my fifth point, economic federalism, or rather, sorry, fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism has empowered the states like nothing more. Of course, the GST is an exception because currently the GST money is not going to the states. But when the GST has stabilized and full money flows start, I have no doubt that 45% itself will be exceeded. And therefore, this becomes a major point of strengthening the states' hands in terms of fiscal federalism. They are not dependent. They are not beggars, which they used to call themselves to the same extent earlier, and dependent on central government largesse, although the central government has many ways of not giving, delaying, or circumventing. But still, in theory and in actual practice also, the Finance Commission has ensured that roughly 43% is already going and it is close to 45%. The sixth, and by no means the least important, one of the most important of federalism, federation, decentralization, is the growth of regional parties and coalitions. This I can call political federalism. You can give these names depending on how you like. But, and remember, in our drawing rooms in Delhi and Mumbai and maybe in Ahmedabad, we don't like this cacophony of small regional parties. We consider them divisive. We consider them against the national interest. But you know that for many decades now, more regional parties rule India's map than either of the two major so-called national parties. You say the map at any time. There are temporary aberrations. The current ruling party claimed at one time it rules about 70%. See the map, neither that nor the erstwhile ruling party rules anything like that. On the contrary, the largest color of the map is non-national parties. Equally, coalition governance has become structurally enmeshed and embedded in India. Since which year? In particular, since 1991. Pre-91, of course, we had coalitions, but structurally embedded is only after 1991. What is the result of these two and why is it linked to federalism? Another name for federalism, just like another name for federalism is decentralization, giving up, spreading. Another name for it is regionalism. The expectations, the hopes, the fears, the anxieties of local people are better in many ways for local issues conveyed through regional vehicles, which are regional political parties. It is not to say that national parties don't have a role, they have a very important role. And the Indian voter is intelligent enough to make a difference in his mind between a national issue and a state issue or a local issue. He votes three different political colors in the municipal election, in the state election, and in the national election. He's that clever. And he changes the three colors next time if he likes. But the important point is that this gives federalism a much stronger vehicle post 91 and post 2000 than it did ever before when our constitution was framed. Today, the biggest defenders, the biggest screams and shouts when you assault federalism will come from a regional party in anything, because that regional party has to run list 2 of our constitution if they find an inroad. Otherwise, the fact that the political color between the center and the region or the state matched, it meant that federalism was a casualty actually. So sometimes what we think to be irritating, not as good as we like in our ordered drawing rooms, is actually a promotion of federalism. So friends, this is the second part which I've done of comparison of the origin conception of federalism, and I gave you several articles to show how it was largely unitary, the constitution, versus the journey from 1950 to 2020 about our actually becoming inadvertent federalism, accidental federalism, unintended federalism. I now come to other particularized issues of federalism, which will be the third part, before I come to COVID, which is the end of the third part. One particularized aspect, and now I'm talking specifics, but important organs. And you will notice I'm trying to avoid politics altogether. It has nothing to do with politics. This is to do with institution building. This is to do with concepts. This is to do with constitutional structures. Parties and governments come and go, but constitutional structures, once they are subverted, take a long time to build. So the third aspect is a very important catalyst or concept within federalism, the name of the post of governor. Governor plays one of the most important roles in federalism because he is in a sense, the agent, protector, runner, organizer, manager of federalism. He is the continuity between the unitary and the federal. He is the connectivity. Unfortunately, and you know how that role is there. It is there in, for example, you pick up Article 356, the governor's role is there, primary role. You pick up the 10th schedule, the main role is of the speaker, but frequently it has to intermesh with the governor. You pick up government formation, vote of confidence, calling the house. You've seen recently what happened in Rajasthan. You've seen elsewhere. The governor plays or can play an important role. Now, my lament is that the governor unfortunately has failed. The institution has failed. I'm not talking of Governor A or Governor B. The institution has failed completely. And unless we say it bluntly, as Palkhiwala said, words must be an assault on the senses for reform to occur. Without words being an assault on senses, reform will not occur. Either you drastically amend and change the governor's position, or you abolish this post. Governors have become agents of the central government, be whatever the central government. Governors have become agents of assault on the constitution. Governors may have become agents to buy time, not to give time, to change governments, but certainly they have taken partisan stands, and this is across the board. I'm talking of politically neutral events. Examples may relate to a particular government, but ultimately it has happened time and again in our 75 years. Now it is interesting that the conception of a governor was ornamental. The ornament has become the boss. Because for misuse purposes, you need to start acting like a chief minister. And there are 2 or 3 very nice thoughts. And the word ornamental is not mine. It is Ambedkar's, Dr. Balasaheb Ambedkar, not Sahab. Dr. Sahab's word is ornamental. In fact, if I just read you 2 or 3 interesting quotations which I have in front of me. On 31 May 1949, he said, I'm quoting Dr. Ambedkar, 31 May 1949, we felt that the powers of the governor were so limited, so nominal, his position so ornamental, that probably very few would come forward even to stand for election to that post. So we should have nomination, no election. That's how you start nominating governor. Otherwise, the original proposal was to have elections. Then On the same day, 31st May 1949, he said again, further down, if the governor is a purely constitutional governor with no more powers than what we contemplate expressly to give him in the Act, and he has no power to interfere with the internal administration of a provincial ministry, I personally do not see any very fundamental objection to having a nomination, because he had said earlier that hardly anybody would want the post. Then on 2nd of June 1949, he said, quote, is all quotation, not a single word is mine. The first thing I would like the House to bear in mind is this: the governor under the Constitution has no functions which he can discharge by himself, no functions at all. That's not strictly true, but what he meant is largely true. Now, there is a separate debate in those days, which you will see in the same debates, which, to put a nice Hindi phrase, एक म्यान में दो तलवार नहीं रह सकती. You have no principle of diarchy, not two swords in one scabbard. So the governor is not an alternative chief minister. There are no two chief ministers in a state. There is only one chief minister. And the governor, therefore, has no executive role. This is very important for governors today to remember. When they are exercising executive roles completely. There is a governor in an eastern state, which I will not name, who calls meetings directly with all officials of the district administration and may even hold a press conference against his own government. After all, he is the head of the government, the governor. There are governors who in the western state of India have not acquitted themselves with glory recently. Now, this sentiment of no diarchy, ornamental, bound by the advice of the state government, they said that suppose you are an elected chief minister with a cabinet. Let us assume you are doing blunders. You have to wait for a government change. The people will be judging those blunders. The governor is not a super chief minister who will correct the chief minister. On the contrary, he is bound by the advice of that cabinet of the state chief minister, of the state government. Then came, after that in sequence, so first was our Constituent Assembly debates, then came our constitution. As you know, the governor is given no powers except in two situations. Of course, his powers are slightly more than the president because of a particular reason. One, in 356, he plays a special role. Two, when the chief minister has lost the complete majority clearly. So if a chief minister is in minority, he can't advise the governor to do this because he's no more a chief minister in majority. Third, all the other functions are largely ornamental. For example, calling the house. You see, as you know, that way all letters in your state of Gujarat will be issued in the name of the governor. As you know, at the bottom of the letter you read in the official government letters or in Articles 296, by order or under the authority of the governor. That doesn't mean the governor is exercising any power. When the governor convenes the assembly of a state, even the address he reads is written for him by the state government. Now, suppose the governor starts saying, I am going to read my own address, in which I lay down my own policies. And I may not agree with some policies of state government, so I'll criticize them. That's not available. Because ultimately, our Bible, our Gita has to be the Constitution. Then came, after many years, one of the most comprehensive reports on the subject, Sarkaria Commission. I don't want to, again, Sarkaria Commission is the Bible of federalism, because it was a relook at what was not mentioned in the Constitution, what has become a basic structure, what was dealt with comprehensively by Sarkaria, a very wise, hardworking man. And I'm not going to read it, but if you read paras 4.6.12, 4.2.06, 4.16.02 and 0.03 and 4.16.20. I've just mentioned 5 paras of Sarkaria. He goes into and says the same thing as Ambedkar said, that governors be warned our constitutional structure. This, remember, is when we had 20 years of our constitution functioning, because Sarkaria was in the 70s and 80s. He said governors should be warned, the chief minister is the boss, the government of the state is the boss, their advice is binding. Like it or not, governors don't play an executive role. Then there is, of course, the Punchi Commission, which you don't need to go into, but had the same sentiments repeated a third time. And apart from that, there are innumerable Supreme Court judgments. innumerable, not one. And once the Council of Ministers gives advice to the governor under 163, he is bound by that, as exactly is the provision for the central government, with the difference of 356. When the Central Council of Ministers advises the president, he is bound by it. Obviously, the president has got no 356. I mean, there is no 356 power over the central government, as by the way, Pakistan has. The president there has a power to dismiss the central government under 356 of theirs, but we have none. So, what is the Supreme Court, which is the fourth head in the 75 years, say on governors or on presidents? I mean, for students of law, there are hundreds of judgments, so there's no point reciting the judgment, but just note three. Shamsher Singh is the most famous and the most important. 1974, 7 judges. That remains the law 45 years now. That's the seminal judgment. Shamsher Singh basically said in 7-judge combination that everything is done in the name of the central government or the state government. Sorry, I'm very sorry. Everything is done in the name of the president or the governor, but it is done by the central government or the state government. And those of you who want to read it, says, in constitutional law, I'm quoting, the functions of the president and the governor and the business of the government belong to ministers and not to the head of state. The aid and advice of ministers are terms of art, which in law mean, in the cabinet context of our constitutional scheme, that the aider acts and the advisor decides in his own authority. This is Shamsher Singh in 1974, applies equally to president and to governor. Then, of course, there is Hecht Pharmaceuticals in 1983. I'll not read it. Then there is Nawam Rebia in 2016, 5 judges. All of them repeat, underline, reiterate, emphasize the same principles. Why? Because it is very important for delicate balance in the Constitution. Without the constitutional balance, we will be today, therefore, governors who try to be a bull in a china shop. They have to be deprecated. Today, unfortunately, if you ignore such principles, the governor will become an agent of the political color of the center. Tomorrow it is your color, today it is my color, day after tomorrow it is Ms. Purvi Porkia's color, it doesn't matter. Wherever that color matches the state government's governor and the central government appoints governors, then you can wreak havoc. That is not the basis on which our constitution was drafted. Given, and I can only end on this part by telling you that the examples in Rajasthan, earlier the examples in Maharashtra for that matter, earlier the examples in other states have been extremely pitiful. It doesn't matter, today I will go as governor, somebody else will come. Tomorrow somebody else will go, third person will come. But it will kill the institution. And therefore the killing of that institution is the real issue, which is why a stage has come that unless governors realize the origin, the development and the evolution of what our founding fathers thought was the true intent, this post would have to come near to extinction. Not that I am asking for extinction, but I am saying the way things are going, because ultimately the only answer in my view is appoint, if you want to retain the post, what is the reform? Appoint Nobel laureates or eminent academics only. You cannot have this theoretical nicety, I would call it ridiculousness, that all your life you're attached to your mother with the umbilical cord. And today I appoint you governor and suddenly the umbilical cord is cut. And you will ignore your mother, which is the political party from where you've been born. So therefore, I think this is very artificial. Either don't have governors posts or stop appointing anything to do with politics. Just to say I am now retired and I can go is not good enough. If you want to have governors, find Nobel laureates, find outstanding educationists, find outstanding philosophers, find outstanding independent persons. But since I know that you will not find them, since I know that you will identify them and then precisely choose the opposite, then it's better to abolish. We now come to some other issues towards the last part I'm going of my lecture. COVID-related issues. and why they come into federalism? Well, the simple answer is, as I said, COVID teaches us many things. The most important thing it teaches us is minimalism. I've been able to spend almost 6 months with about 1/10 of the items I used to use prior to those 6 months. Not even 1/20th, I would say. And you find there's a nice book called The Power of 30. The Power of 30, which says that you can and should and must force yourself to live with only 30 items. And 30 must include everything, including your underclothes. So the power of 30 is the power of minimalism. COVID has forced you to be minimalistic, not necessarily 30. But one of the other grants of COVID is this great anti-federal act, Disaster Management Act. Now, Disaster Management Act, as you know, obviously was not made for COVID, and obviously the necessary act. And I'm very supportive of it. I'm not decrying it. Because today you have pandemic, God forbid, you may have something else in future. So it is required. But let us look at it as lawyers from the point of view of federalism. And let me at the beginning say that, but for the fact that we are battling for our lives in the worst scourge of humanity, at last count, you had 1.75 crores cases. And I don't know how many, 50 lakhs or what figure is there were deaths, some very large number of deaths. In this worst case scenario, I don't expect that any challenges to an act like this will succeed in any court. Because somebody has to challenge the act, say it is anti-federal, then a court has to issue notice, hear arguments, and then strike it down. Given the public interest nature of this act, the practical answer is that I don't think any judge or any court is easily going to strike it down. But it nevertheless remains an interesting issue of law. And all law develops by law being tested. It is tested in unusual situations, sometimes in the far future. But it lays down new law, and who knows what will happen in the future. Well, first of all, it is difficult to pinpoint where this Disaster Management Act is located. It is not very easy to pinpoint that. The entries I could make a list of are 4, if you want to note it down. List 3, entry 3, and entry 29. And list 2 is entry 6 and entry 15. Now, list 3, entry 3, I don't much agree with at all, but I'm just telling you. It is maintenance of supplies and services essential to the community. It is an ancillary thing, but it's not the main heart of the Disaster Management Act. List 2, entry 6 is public health and sanitation. It doesn't really, hospitals and dispensaries, doesn't really cover. And list 2, entry 15 is animal diseases. Unless you consider human beings to be mammals and therefore animals, it won't be covering. Well, it really leaves only entry 29, list 3, which is the closest. Remember, it's a list 3 item, which is why the central government enacted it, the Disaster Management Act. It reads prevention of extension from one state to another of infections or contagious diseases or pests affecting men, animals, and plants. So I think it is far-fetched to suggest that the competence, or what we call, lawyers call legislative competence to enact the state, does not lie with the central government. So that is the first part. It appears, and this is of course not an act limited to pandemics, right? It is all forms of disasters, typhoons, floods, and a combination of these entries would cover it. In the case of pandemics, clearly list 3 would cover it. Some of the sections of the Disaster Management Act must be kept in mind, and I'm not going to go into the details. Section 10 is a catch-all section. And if you read under section 10(2), there's a long listing of what you can do. And people say that even the direction to continue to pay wages during COVID, as they say, came under section 10(2)(I). Now, you will not find a mention of wages anywhere. in the Disaster Management Act. But general power to regulate things during disasters. Apparently, the central government has issued notifications saying you shall not reduce, you shall pay. Now, I believe that you can challenge them. I believe at a future point of time, some court may even strike it down because there is no mention remotely about wages in the Disaster Management Act. And for maintaining pandemics, if they tell you how to dress, how not to dress, well, there is a problem. But I don't see this as in any manner relevant today because no court is going to interfere. The other sections to be noted are sections 35, 62 and 65, which are directly on federalism. Because 35 says the central government shall take all steps necessary or expedient for disaster management. All steps necessary or expedient for disaster management. And 35.2 has even wider. Then section 62 starts with a non-obstant clause. It says notwithstanding anything contained in anything else, etc., etc. Now this provision read with 65 is effectively, I am paraphrasing it, if a central government authority, the Disaster Management Authority, gives a direction to any central agency, then to any state agency, then to any panchayat or sub-state agency, they are all bound to follow it. Can you normally, as a central government, suppose he is a central government, suppose you, the dean, is a state government, can a central government give a direction to the state government on everything? No, cannot. But this section says that forget state government, any direction by the disaster authority, which functions under the Home Ministry, to any organ in the country, which includes state governments, panchayats, departments, individual officers, leave aside the judiciary, every authority in the country is obliged to obey it, obliged to implement it, and failure to implement is punishable with very severe penalties, including imprisonment. Now, seen as a lawyer, this is clearly a violation of federalism. And it is not a violation of federalism to enact the act, because the act is required for disaster. But how to interpret the act, how to define boundaries of the act. And the best example is pandemic, because you cannot have a more extreme emergency than the pandemic. Well, time may have come to say that in the name of pandemic management, you cannot tell me what to dress, what to eat, how to sneeze, how to go to the bathroom, what not to do. There is a limit, and those boundaries only courts will draw. And the courts drawing these boundaries will have to be done in peaceful times, also for a more objective analysis. But I've given you an idea that read literally, in the ancillary sense, everything we do is related to the pandemic. So you can give directions for everything. Just yesterday, we have finished arguing that the reverse case, that on pandemic, so many restrictions were given, then why should the UGC direction to have exams be upheld for universities? Because the UGC Act is an older act. It is not a special act. The Disaster Management Act is a more newer, recent act. It is a special act. So these are the kind of questions. Well, friends, as I start winding down and winding up, we must realize that the biggest threat to federalism ultimately lies in how you operate it, how you are aware of it, how you restrain yourself. Today, there will always be at least one state with the political color of that state is the same as the political color of the central government. Take two opposite examples. If you defy federalism and state X, which has exclusive law and order competence, as you know, states have exclusive competence on law and order, no central government power. If state X with exclusive competence starts investigating what it considers to be a crime, now it doesn't matter whether central government or state Y likes it or not. It doesn't matter whether it suits them or not. The power is in the state X, and if he's not doing it properly, then you can go to a magistrate, then you can go to the High Court, then you can go to the Supreme Court, or you can ask in law properly how to transfer that case to other agencies. But you cannot say that state X case being interrogated for crime can be taken by state Z. So look at federalism from this point of view, that state Z, simply by filing an FIR, appropriates the case. And then in the same breath, transfers it to any agency like CBI or BSF or whatever. Of course, what you don't own, you can't transfer. What you don't have jurisdiction on, you can't transfer. But these are important, and the reverse may happen. Suppose a state which is irresponsible, doesn't like the Prime Minister, and on a central issue, a central policy decision, let us say fixing a price of oil, the central officers take a decision. The oil is a central government subject. And a state files an FIR naming those central government officials and also the Prime Minister. And they send a police force from that state to interrogate the Prime Minister. Now, everything cannot be written in the Constitution. The Constitution framers assumed that people who operate the Constitution will not be told how to get up, how to sit down, how to wear a coat, how to take off a shirt. They relied on the spirit, the thinking, the far-sightedness, the perspicacity, the maturity. They relied on the fact that you would operate the spirit of this concept without doing violence to the letter of it. Not that you will be technical, manipulative. A strong exception to all these negativities which I've been speaking about for the last while, just so that I end on a slightly positive note, is the GST, by the way. Both competitive federalism can be a scourge, cooperative federalism can be a great benefit. GST would not be possible without federalism, because GST is a single rate concept which applies to all states. Now, your state in the northeast, my state in the south, his state in the east, in the west will not agree. So this GST council idea, all of which was, by the way, in the previous government's model, which was fortunately adopted and implemented and will now stabilize. All of this is possible only by having all the states represented on a GST council. And decision making on that council is by 1/3 weight of the vote in central government and 2/3 weight of the vote in state governments collectively. This is true federalism, constructive federalism, positive federalism, cooperative federalism. An example which tells you how things are not merely pessimistic, but they can work in a proper way. And they've made simple rules that even within this 2/3, 1/3 weightage, normally if more than 50% are opposing, we will not implement. So ultimately, the pruning of rates, the making of decisions that it should not harm any particular state, the very concept of GST would not be possible unless constructive cooperative federalism operated. So you have the positive and the negative, and I've given you both important examples. Well, friends, I have spoken longer than I intended, and I have, I think, broadly covered all the areas. It's now about 1 hour, 15 minutes from when I started. Let me end by saying that federalism is what federalism does. It's not a mere word. It's not a mere textbook, jurisprudential abstraction. It is real operation to make our democracy strong. It depends, as I said, on institutional mechanisms. It depends on institutional structures. I give the example of GST Council. But above all, it depends on the human beings who run it. An institution is only as good as the last human being who ran it. Institutions are empty structures. And federalism, unless we start remembering it and treasuring it, cherishing it as a treasure, unless we start respecting it, unless we start enlarging and expanding it, and mere awareness is half the battle won. Well, unless we do that, generations will not forgive us, and we'll be guilty of what Iqbal said in his famous words. Don't need to quote the whole couplet, but certainly we'll be guilty of other people pointing a finger and saying, लम्हों ने खता की, सदियों ने सजा पाई. Thank you very much.